Welcome. Get comfortable. The story you're about to hear will pull at your heart from the first minute.
The water had taken the porch light first. Foster remembered that detail with a strange aching clarity. How the bulb his father had installed 30 years ago, the one that always buzzed faintly on summer nights when moths gathered around it, had simply winked out beneath the brown churn of the flood before anything else went under. He had stood on the rise behind the house with Duke barking at his heel and watched the water swallow the porch, then the windows, then the roofline, until there was nothing left of the place he'd been born in but a smear of debris and a slow, indifferent current where his life used to be. Now he sat on the edge of a green canvas cot in the middle of a high school gymnasium that smelled of bleach and wet dog and too many bodies pressed into too small a space, and he could not stop hearing that buzzing porch light in his mind, even though it was gone, even though there was nothing left to buzz. The duffel bag sat between his boots like a small, sad monument. He'd packed it in 9 minutes. 9 minutes was all the water had given him before it came up over the tractor tires and into the barn, and what he'd grabbed made no sense to him. Now, 2 shirts, his father's pocket knife, a framed photo of his mother that he hadn't looked at since he'd shoved it in, face down, wrapped in a dish towel. His county fair ribbon from when he was 19, blue for best heifer, which he didn't even know why he'd taken, except that his hand had closed around it in the dark, and some animal part of him had decided it mattered. Everything else. The barn, the east pasture, 40 head of cattle. He hadn't been able to move fast enough. The equipment shed his grandfather built with his own hands in 1961, all of it was underwater, or gone, carried off toward the county line like it had never existed at all. Foster pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes until he saw white sparks, willing himself not to do anything as useless as cry in a room full of strangers. Around him the gymnasium hummed with the low, shell-shocked murmur of 200 people who had all lost something in the last 36 hours. Snoring old men, a baby crying somewhere. Near the concession stand, someone's radio playing a staticky country station, too low to make out the words. Cots stretched in crooked rows across the basketball court, some occupied, some still folded and leaning against the cinder block walls, like they were waiting for the flood to bring in more of the drowned out and homeless. Red Cross volunteers moved between them with clipboards and bottled water, and the particular brand of gentle, professional pity that made Foster's back teeth ache. He'd been assigned cot 47 by a tired-looking woman with a lanyard who hadn't quite met his eyes when she told him, and he understood that he probably looked like something the water had spit up. Mud dried in his hairline, on the backs of his hands, under his fingernails, where he'd been trying to pry loose the gate latch to let the cattle run before he gave up, and just opened everything and hoped. His jeans were stiff with dried creek water. He hadn't looked in a mirror in 2 days, and had no wish to start now. The cot beside his, 46, according to the crooked strip of masking tape stuck to the frame, was already occupied. The man sitting on it was big in a way that didn't announce itself loudly, the kind of big built from decades of physical work rather than a gym membership. Dark, wavy hair, threaded through at the temples, with grey he probably hadn't earned gracefully. Broad shoulders, slightly hunched forward, elbows braced on his knees, hands hanging loose between them, big hands, weathered, a farmer's hands or a rancher's, the kind of hands that Foster recognized instinctively because his own looked the same. The man was staring at some middle distance on the gym floor, like he was doing the same thing Foster had just been doing, replaying the last thing he saw before the water came. He looked up when Foster's cot frame creaked and their eyes met. The stranger's eyes were a deep, steady brown, and there was something in them that Foster wasn't prepared for. Not pity, not the careful blankness so many of the volunteers wore like a uniform, but a kind of quiet recognition. Like he knew exactly what Foster was carrying, even though neither of them had said a word. "It's not so bad once you get used to it," the man said. His voice was low, a little rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Springs dig into your back a little on the left side. Figured that out the hard way around 3 this morning." It wasn't much of a joke, barely qualified as one, but Foster appreciated the attempt at normalcy the way you appreciate a hand offered across a chasm. He managed something that wasn't quite a laugh, more an exhale with shape to it. "Appreciate the warning," Foster said, setting his duffel down at the foot of his cot, with more care than the bag probably deserved. He sat, and the springs did exactly what the man had said they would, biting faintly into his lower back. He shifted, found a spot where it hurt less, and gave up trying to get comfortable altogether. Comfort felt like something that belonged to a version of his life that didn't exist past yesterday morning. "Foster," he said, because it seemed like the thing to do, extending a hand that he only belatedly realized still had a rim of dried mud under the nails. The stranger didn't seem to mind. His grip was solid, warm, brief, exactly as much contact as the moment called for, and not a second more. "Grady," the man said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Around them the gymnasium kept up its low tide of noise, someone coughing, the metallic clatter of a cot being unfolded 2 rows over, the Red Cross woman's voice rising gently as she asked an elderly man if he needed his blood pressure medication refilled. Foster found himself grateful for the anonymity of it all, the way tragedy on this scale made everyone equally invisible. Nobody here was going to ask him if he was doing okay in that particular tone people used when they already knew the answer was no. "You lose much?" Grady asked eventually, and the question came out careful, like he turned it over first to make sure it wasn't going to cut on the way out. Foster looked down at his hands, at the mud still ground into the creases of his knuckles. "Farm," he said. It came out flatter than he meant it to. Flat in the particular way that meant, if he let any inflection into it at all, something underneath might come loose. "Cattle house. Pretty much everything but what's in that bag." He nodded toward the duffel, like it was evidence in some trial he hadn't agreed to stand for. "You? Same story?" "Different farm," Grady said. "Lost the barn for sure. House might still be standing. Water was up to the 2nd-story windows last I saw it, before they made us leave. Don't know about the horses. I got 4 of them loose, before the road washed out, but I couldn't get back for the 5th. His jaw worked once, a small, controlled motion, like he was chewing down whatever feeling had tried to surface. Anyway. Foster understood that word better than any other word he'd heard in the last 2 days. It was the sound of a man closing a door on something because opening it any further wasn't survivable yet. "Anyway," Foster echoed. And something about saying it back, about being understood in that specific wordless way, loosened something small and tight behind his sternum. Not enough to breathe easy. Just enough to notice he'd been holding his breath at all. He studied Grady sideways. Not, obviously, he told himself, just a passing assessment the way you'd size up anyone you were going to be sleeping 4 feet from for God knew how many nights. Grady looked to be pushing 40, maybe a few years past it, with a kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and looked all the better for it, weathered in a way that read as solid rather than worn down. He had a few days of dark stubble coming in, grey threading through it, same as his hair. His flannel shirt was stained dark at the collar with dried mud and sweat, sleeves shoved up to reveal forearms corded with the specific muscle that came from hauling feed and fixing fence, not from any machine at a gym. There was something steady about him, Foster thought. Something that made the chaotic hum of the gymnasium feel a little less like it was pressing directly against his skull. "They got food going by the far wall, if you're hungry," Grady said, after a moment, tilting his head toward the tables set up near the stage, where the volunteers were dishing out something that steamed faintly in styrofoam bowls. Chili, I think, or what's calling itself chili, wouldn't win any ribbons, but it's hot. Foster's stomach, which he'd been ignoring with the same stubbornness he applied to most inconvenient truths lately, chose that moment to growl audibly, and he felt his ears go warm despite everything. "Guess that answers that," Grady said, and there was the ghost of something almost like humor at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it came, but Foster had seen it. It did something strange and small to his chest, seeing that flicker of warmth on a stranger's face in the middle of all this wreckage, like proof that warmth still existed somewhere, that the whole world hadn't gone grey and waterlogged. "Been a while since I ate," Foster admitted. "Been kind of busy not drowning." He said it dry, almost bitter, the words scraping a little on the way out, and immediately regretted the note of self-pity he heard in his own voice. He wasn't a man who did that, who let people see the rawness underneath. His father had raised him on the doctrine that you kept your hurt behind your teeth and your work in front of your eyes, that a man's suffering was his own business and nobody else's burden. 20 years of farming, of burying that same father, of running the place alone, since that doctrine had only calcified. But Grady didn't flinch at it, didn't get that careful, pitying softness in his eyes that Foster had been bracing for since he walked in the door. He just nodded slowly, like it was a perfectly reasonable thing to say, like drowning was just another line item on the day's to-do list. "Yay," Grady said. "That'll do it." They sat with that for a moment, the two of them, cots 4 feet apart, in a gymnasium full of strangers who'd all lost something, all of them breathing the same bleach and mildew air, all of them waiting for word about roads and water levels and whether there'd be anything left to go home to. Somewhere behind them, a child asked her mother when they could go back for her dog, and the mother's answer was too quiet to hear, which told Foster everything he needed to know about how that conversation was going. "You want to go get some of that chili?" Grady asked. And it wasn't really a question about food. Foster understood that too. It was an offer of company, low stakes and easy to refuse, the kind of gesture two guarded men could make to each other without either of them having to admit they didn't want to be alone with their own heads right now. Foster looked at his duffel bag one more time, at the small sad shape of everything he had left in the world, and then he looked back at Grady, at the steadiness in those brown eyes, at the broad set of his shoulders that seemed built for carrying weight, at the quiet way he'd made space for Foster's grief without demanding to know the size of it. "Yeah," Foster said, and stood, his knees aching from 2 days of wading through cold water and standing in lines and holding himself together by sheer stubborn will. "Yeah, all right." They walked together across the gymnasium floor, weaving between cots and the outstretched legs of strangers, past a volunteer handing out donated blankets, past a bulletin board already filling up with handwritten notes. Asterisk, has anyone seen a brown lab named Scout? Answers to Scout, please call asterisk, and Foster felt something shift almost imperceptibly in his chest. Some small internal gear catching for the first time since the water came. It wasn't hope, exactly. He wouldn't have called it that, not yet. Not with the wreckage of his whole life still soaking somewhere behind him under a brown and merciless flood. But it was something, a cot beside a quiet stranger. A voice that didn't ask too much or offer false comfort. A shared destination, even if that destination was only a folding table and a bowl of bad chili. It was, he thought, as they crossed the gym floor side by side, the first thing that had felt steady in 2 days. And when Grady's shoulder brushed his, just barely, just enough to register warm and solid through 2 layers of damp flannel, Foster didn't step away. The chili was exactly as bad as Foster expected, thin and orange-slicked and tasting faintly of tin, but he ate 2 bowls anyway, sitting hip to hip with Grady on a folding bench too short for either of them, their knees nearly touching under the table. Around them the gymnasium hummed with a particular exhausted noise of 200 displaced people trying to make a temporary peace with disaster. Children crying in the bleachers, a radio somewhere playing gospel too low to make out words, an old woman 2 tables over, praying the rosary with her eyes closed and her lips moving fast. Like speed might make God listen. Harder. Grady didn't talk much while they ate. He wasn't a man who filled silence for the sake of filling it. Foster was learning, and there was something almost restful in not having to perform gratitude or grief or anything at all. Just eat bad chili next to a man with tired brown eyes and let the noise of the room wash over both of them like weather. By the time they made their way back to the cots, the light through the high gymnasium windows had gone the color of a bruise, purple-gray and heavy, and the volunteers were moving through the rows, switching on the overhead fluorescents one bank at a time, chasing the dark back into the corners. "Storm's coming," Grady said, glancing up at the windows. "Feel it in my knee before I see it any more, old injury. Farm work. Rodeo. A long time ago. Different kind of stupid. Faint. Almost smile. You. Tractor rolled on me once 10 years back. Nothing broke, just bruised most of one side of my body for a month. Didn't feel stupid at the time, felt like dying." Foster eased himself down onto his cot, the springs complaining under him, and pulled his boots off with the particular tenderness of a man whose feet hadn't been properly dry in 2 days. Felt smarter after. That's usually how it goes. They settled into that easy quiet again, the one that had started to feel less like the silence of strangers, and more like something companionable, something Foster didn't examine too closely because he was afraid of what he'd find if he did. He lay back on the thin cot mattress, laced his fingers over his stomach, and stared up at the rafters of the gymnasium ceiling, at the ductwork and the hanging basketball hoops folded up against the walls, at the whole strange architecture of a place built for one purpose, now serving another. Grady lay down beside him on his own cot, close enough that Foster could hear him breathing, close enough that when Grady shifted, the sound of cot legs scraping against gym floor seemed to happen in stereo, doubled between them. Outside, the first low growl of thunder rolled in from somewhere over the ridge. Foster felt it before he heard it, a vibration low in his chest, the kind of thunder that meant business, that meant the sky wasn't finished with them yet, even after 2 days of rain that had already taken everything he owned. His stomach clenched involuntarily. He told himself it was just weather. Weather couldn't take anything else from him. There was nothing left to take. That wasn't true, and some small, clear part of his mind knew it wasn't true, because there was still the farm itself, sitting under all that brown water, the house and the barn and 40 acres of bottomland that his grandfather had cleared by hand 3 generations back, and rain like this hard, unrelenting. Biblical could mean the difference between water that receded and water that didn't, between a farm you could salvage and a farm that was simply gone, erased, returned to the river the way the river probably always intended. The lights buzzed and dimmed once, a half-second flicker that made the whole gymnasium hold its breath collectively, and then came back up, steady. "Here we go," someone muttered a few cots down. The rain hit the roof all at once, not building gradually, but arriving like a slap, thousands of gallons finding metal and turning it into a drum, and underneath that drumming came the low, continuous rumble of thunder that didn't fully stop between claps anymore, just rolled and rolled like something enormous turning over in its sleep. Foster lay still and listened to it, and felt his carefully constructed composure, the thing he'd been holding together with, will alone, since the water first came into his kitchen and floated his boots off the mat by the door, begin, quietly, to come apart. He didn't cry. He wasn't built for crying, not since his father died, and he'd stood dry-eyed at the graveside, while his mother wept enough for both of them. Some deep well in him, sealed off early and never quite reopened. But something in his chest went tight and small and cold, and his hands, laced over his stomach, curled into loose fists without his permission. The lights flickered again. This time, they stayed out for 3 full seconds, long enough for the dark to feel total, for the gymnasium to fill with a low collective murmur of unease, a few children's voices rising in complaint or fear, and then the emergency generator kicked in somewhere with a mechanical shudder, and half the lights came back, dimmer, amber-tinted, throwing everything into a strange, sepia dusk. In that half-dark, with rain hammering the roof and thunder rolling continuous overhead, Foster heard himself speak before he'd decided to. "I don't know if there's going to be anything to go back to." His voice came out low, rough, not really pitched to carry beyond the space between their 2 cots. He hadn't meant to say it. He'd meant to keep it locked down where he kept everything. In that sealed place behind his sternum where his father's death and his mother's slow fading afterward and every other loss he'd swallowed over 34 years, all lived, filed away, and unexamined. But the dark and the thunder, and 2 days of holding himself together had worn something loose, and the words had just come unbidden into the amber dimness of the gymnasium. Grady didn't answer right away. Foster heard him shift on the cot beside him, the springs creaking, and for a moment he thought maybe Grady hadn't heard, or had heard, didn't know what to do with it, and Foster almost took it back, almost said asterisk, "Forget it, don't mind me," the way he'd said to a dozen people over the last 2 days when his voice cracked and he needed to paper over it fast. But then Grady's voice came, quiet even, pitched, just for the 2 of them. "Tell me." "Not asterisk." "It'll be all right." Asterisk. "Not asterisk." "I'm sure it's fine." Asterisk. Not any of the things people had been saying to Foster for 2 days, the automatic reassurances that cost the speaker nothing and meant less, that Foster had learned to nod through and let slide off him like water off a tin roof. Just asterisk. Tell me. Asterisk. 2 words that asked for the actual size of it, that made room instead of trying to fill the space up with false comfort. Foster turned his head on the thin pillow and found Grady already looking at him in the amber half-light, his broad shoulders taking up more of the narrow cot than it was built for, his dark, wavy hair mussed against the pillow, his eyes steady and dark and waiting. 40 acres, Foster said, and his voice cracked on the second word humiliatingly, and he had to stop and swallow before he could go on. "Bottomland, mostly." "My grandfather cleared it by hand back in the 50s. My dad worked it his whole life. I took it over 8 years ago, when he got too sick to keep doing it himself. Soybeans, some corn, a little bit of hay for the neighbors' cattle. Nothing fancy, never made me rich. But it was mine, you understand. It was—" He stopped again, throat working. Thunder cracked directly overhead, loud enough that a few cots down a child startled awake crying, and a mother's voice rose soft and soothing in the dark, and Foster waited for it to pass before he continued. "Why? It was the only thing I ever built that lasted, and right now it's probably 10 feet under, and even if the water goes down, there's no telling what's left. Topsoil doesn't come back easy after a flood like this. Barn's probably gone entirely. It wasn't built to take that kind of current. House might still be standing, might not, I don't know. I've been sitting here for 2 days not knowing, and I don't." His breath hitched, and he hated himself for it, hated the wet catch in his own throat, and he pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eyes for a second, like he could push the whole feeling back down where it belonged. "I don't know how to just not know. I've always known things. I've always had a plan. Weather comes, you know what to do. You've done it your whole life. You were raised doing it. There's no plan for this. There's nothing to do but sit here and wait and hope the water's kind. And water's never once in my life been kind." He fell silent, chest rising and falling too fast, ashamed suddenly of how much he'd said, how much he'd let slip out into the dark between them, like something spilled that couldn't be put back in the bottle. He stared up at the rafters and waited for Grady to say something useless, something well-meaning and empty, and braced himself against the particular disappointment of hearing it. Grady didn't say anything for a long moment. The generator hummed, the rain kept coming, thunder rolled long and low somewhere out past the ridge, and beside him Foster felt Grady shift again on the cot, closer this time, until the warmth of his shoulder and upper arm pressed lightly, steadily against Foster's own. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't Grady reaching for his hand or pulling him into an embrace or saying any of the soft, reassuring things Foster had heard a dozen times already and trusted none of. It was just weight and warmth, solid and unmoving, offered without comment, where you'd brace a fence post against wind, not to stop the wind, because you couldn't, but so the post had something to lean into while the wind did what it was going to do anyway. "My place is gone," Grady said finally, his voice low, even lower than before, pitched for just the two of them under the roar of the rain. "Not maybe gone, gone, gone. I got the call yesterday morning before I ever got here. Neighbor drove up on his tractor to check the road, and called me from what was left of it. Water took the whole east wall of the house. Barn's flat. Everything I had is either under water or halfway to the Gulf by now." Foster turned his head sharply, surprised. Grady hadn't mentioned this once in 2 days, not during the long hours of standing in registration lines, or eating donated sandwiches, or lying awake in the dark of the gymnasium the first night, and Foster had assumed, without really thinking about it, that Grady's losses were smaller than his own, that Grady was simply a calm man by nature, rather than a man holding himself together with the same stubborn will Foster recognized in his own chest. "You didn't say anything," Foster said. "Didn't seem like it would help you any, hearing it." Grady's shoulder was still pressed warm against his, and in the dim amber light Foster could see the line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the particular stillness of a man who'd already done his crying somewhere private, and wasn't going to do it again here. "Figured you had enough weight of your own without me adding mine to the pile. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's going to be fine, because I don't know that. Nobody knows that. Water does what it wants and doesn't apologize after. All I know is I'm not going anywhere tonight, and neither are you, and there's no sense either one of us pretending we've got some kind of control over what that water's doing to our land right now. So we might as well not be alone in not knowing." Something in Foster's chest, the thing that had been tight and cold since the thunder started, loosened. Not all at once, not completely, but enough that he felt it, a physical unclenching somewhere behind his sternum, like a fist slowly opening. "That's a hell of a thing to say at midnight in a flood shelter," Foster said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to, thick with something he didn't have a name for. "Never claimed to be good at bedside manner." A faint, almost smile, again there and gone in the dim light. "My ex-wife used to say I had all the tact of a fence post. You mentioned an ex before. 16 years, gone 4 now. Long story, not tonight's story." Grady's shoulder shifted slightly, a small settling motion, and Foster realized with something like wonder that Grady wasn't going to move away, wasn't going to retreat back to the careful distance of two strangers sharing space out of necessity. He was staying deliberately, the warmth of him a steady fixed point against the storm noise and the amber emergency light, and the low murmur of 200 displaced strangers trying to sleep around them. "Point is, I know something about losing things you built your whole life around and having to just keep going anyway, not because you feel ready, because the alternative is worse." Foster didn't answer right away. He lay there in the half-dark with the rain hammering overhead and the thunder rolling long and continuous like something enormous breathing, and he let himself simply feel the solid warmth of another person beside him, not performing comfort, not offering platitudes, just present, just steady. just there in a way that asked nothing of Foster except that he not be alone in the not knowing. "Thank you," he said finally, quiet. And it cost him something to say it, the way gratitude always did when it was real, instead of automatic. "For staying awake. You don't have to." "I know, I don't have to." Grady's voice was even quieter now, almost lost under the rain. "Wanted to." The words sat there between them in the dark, small and plain and enormous all at once, and Foster felt something pass between them that he had no framework for, no name he was ready to reach for, something that wasn't quite comfort and wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite the particular ache. He turned his face toward the ceiling again, toward the rafters and the dim amber lights, and the basketball hoops folded flat against the walls, and beside him Grady's shoulders stayed pressed warm and solid against his own, and neither of them moved to close the small remaining distance or to widen it. And outside the storm went on, indifferent, relentless, taking whatever it was going to take from both of them, whether they slept or not. Foster didn't sleep, not for a long while. But he didn't lie there alone in his fear either, and that, he thought, staring up into the dark with the rain drumming overhead, and Grady's steady breathing beside him, was its own kind of mercy, small, unasked for, and entirely undeserved, the way the best mercies usually were. Morning came the way it had come for 3 days now, grey and reluctant, filtering through the gymnasium's high clerestory windows in bars of pale light that fell across the rows of cots like something out of a hymn nobody wanted to sing anymore. Foster woke to the smell of instant coffee and the low murmur of 200 people trying to be quiet in a room built for echo, and the first thing he was aware of, for his own aching back or the dull throb behind his eyes, was Grady's absence beside him. A coolness where warmth had been, a space that felt larger than it should have for one missing body. He found him by the folding tables near the gymnasium's east doors, already in line for the relief trucks, holding 2 styrofoam cups of coffee and a look on his face like he hadn't expected to be caught doing something so plainly considerate. "Figured you'd want caffeine before you remembered how much everything hurts," Grady said, handing one over. "Generous man, practical man. You're easier to be around once you've had coffee." Foster huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh but was trying to be, and took the cup. Toe. The coffee was burnt, and too hot and tasted faintly of the cardboard it had been stored in, and it was, without question, the best thing he'd had in 5 days. That became the shape of things. After that, not a plan, not anything either of them named out loud, but a rhythm all the same. Grady in the coffee line before Foster woke, saving him a spot at breakfast, the two of them drifting toward the same folding table at lunch, without discussing it, as if their bodies had made an agreement their mouths hadn't caught up to yet. They ate what the relief trucks brought. Sandwiches wrapped too tight in plastic, styrofoam bowls of chili that tasted like the can, apples going soft at the edges. It wasn't good food. Foster found he didn't mind, not really, not with someone across from him who ate, like he meant it and didn't complain, who once slid his own apple across the table wordlessly when Foster's had a bruise the size of a fist. "You don't have to do that," Foster said. "I know," Grady said, and went back to his sandwich like it wasn't worth discussing further. And Foster found himself smiling down at his tray in a way that felt dangerous, like standing too close to a ledge. They talked, in the hours between meals and the restless stretches of afternoon, when the rain kept everyone penned inside, and there was nothing to do but wait for news that didn't come. At first, the talk was small weather, the shelter's terrible coffee, the woman 3 cots down who snored like a chainsaw, the kid who'd found a deck of cards and was systematically fleecing every adult in the building at Go Fish. But small talk had a way of wearing thin when 2 people spent 5 days sitting close enough to feel each other breathe, and somewhere around the 3rd day, conversation started reaching for something with more weight to it. It was Grady who asked, in that careful, unhurried way he had of asking things, not prying, just leaving the door open and waiting to see if you'd walk through it. They were sitting against the gymnasium wall, backs to the cool cinder block, watching rain streak the high windows in grey ropes. "Tell me about the farm," Grady said. "The real version. Not the elevator version you gave the National Guard guy." Foster looked at him sideways. "There's a difference." "There's always a difference." Foster was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands, watching the dark liquid tilt and settle. And then, because Grady was looking at him like the answer actually mattered, because 5 days of shared cots and shared silences had worn some kind of groove between them that made honesty easier than it should have been, he started to talk. He told him about his grandfather, who'd bought the land in 1962 with money saved from 3 years of working someone else's fields, who'd built the first barn with his own hands, and a borrowed mule, who used to say that dirt didn't care what a man believed about it, only what he was willing to do for it. He told him about learning to drive a tractor before he learned to drive a car, about summers spent detasseling corn until his hands bled, about the particular smell of the barn in autumn, hay and diesel, and something underneath that he'd never been able to name, something that just meant home. He told him about his grandfather dying in the same bed he'd been born in the same house, with the same view of the same fields out the window, and how there had been something right about that, something that felt like the land keeping a promise. "And now," Foster said, and his voice had grown rougher, quieter, the words coming slower like they cost something to pull loose. "Now I've got about 60 acres of that land sitting under 4 feet of water, a barn that's probably not structurally sound anymore, and a note at the bank that doesn't care one bit about promises the land made to my grandfather." He looked down at his hands. "Debt's been piling up for a couple years now. Bad seasons, equipment that needed replacing, and I put it off because I didn't have the cash and didn't want the loan. Then this." He gestured vaguely, a motion meant to encompass the flood, the shelter, the whole ruined shape of his life. "Bank's going to take it. I know that. I've known it since I watched the water come up over the porch steps. I just haven't said it out loud yet." Grady didn't say anything right away. He had a way of doing that too, letting silence sit instead of rushing to fill it with something reassuring and empty. When he did speak, his voice was low, careful, like he was handling something breakable. "How much debt are we talking?" Foster gave him a look. "You planning on writing me a check?" "Just asking. Around 40,000. Give or take what the flood adds to it." Foster laughed, short and without humor. "Might as well be 40 million. I don't have either number." Grady nodded slowly, and something moved behind his eyes that Foster couldn't quite read. Not pity, which Foster would have hated, but something more considering than that. More like a man doing math in his head. "What happens if you can't pay it? Bank forecloses, sells the land at auction, probably to some development company that turns it into a subdivision or a solar farm, or whatever makes the most money fastest. 60 years of my family's work turns into somebody's driveway." Foster's jaw tightened. "Sorry, didn't mean to make this a whole thing." "You didn't," Grady said. "I asked." They sat with that for a while, the rain drumming steady overhead, the gymnasium's low hum of 200 displaced lives going on around them, a baby crying somewhere near the west doors, the card game still going strong in the corner, someone's radio playing a country station low enough to be more feeling than sound. Foster became aware gradually of how close Grady's shoulder was to his, how it had become a kind of anchor over these 5 days, something he oriented himself around without quite meaning to. He became aware, too, of how much he'd just handed over, not just facts about acreage and debt, but the shape of his grief, the exact size and weight of what he stood to lose. He hadn't told anyone that. Not the shelter coordinator, not his sister on the one phone call he'd managed to get through, not the National Guard soldier who'd pulled him out of the current 3 days ago. He told a stranger he'd known less than a week, and it hadn't felt like a mistake. That scared him more than the debt did. "You're quiet," Grady said, thinking about the farm, about how easy that was to say to you. Foster shook his head, a small, rueful motion. "I don't usually do that." Grady looked at him for a long moment, something steady and unhurried in his brown eyes, something that made Foster feel seen in a way he wasn't sure he'd ever been seen before, not even by people who'd known him his whole life. "Maybe you needed to say it to someone who wasn't going to look at you different after. You don't look at me different." "No," Grady said. Simple as that, like it wasn't even a question worth deliberating. "Just look at you." Foster didn't have an answer for that. He looked down at his coffee, gone cold in the cup, and didn't say anything, and Grady didn't push, and the rain kept coming down outside, and something in Foster's chest sat there warm and unnamed and a little bit terrifying, and he let it sit, because he didn't have the energy left to fight it. It was the next afternoon, with the rain finally thinning to a grey drizzle and the first cautious talk moving through the shelter about waters starting to recede in the lower valley, that Grady told him what he did for a living. They were sitting on the concrete steps outside the gym's side entrance, under the narrow overhang, watching the drizzle come down over the parking lot and the flooded ditch beyond it, and Foster had asked, half out of genuine curiosity, half just to keep the conversation going, because conversation with Grady had become the thing that made the days bearable, what Grady did when he wasn't sharing cots with strangers in emergency shelters. "Structural engineer," Grady said. "Mostly commercial work, some residential. Spent the last 6 years doing flood mitigation and rebuild consulting. Actually went down to Louisiana after Ida. Spent 4 months in North Carolina after Helene, working with a crew rebuilding houses that had been sitting in 6 feet of water for 2 weeks before anybody could get to them." Foster turned to look at him properly, something shifting into focus. "You know how to fix flood damage. I know how to assess it, know how to fix a lot of it. Foundations, framing, load-bearing issues. Water does specific kinds of damage, and most of it's fixable if you catch it before mold and rot get too far into things." Grady was quiet for a second, watching the rain, and then he said, "Careful," like he was setting something down gently so it wouldn't break on the way out of his mouth. "I could look at your place when the water's down enough to get in there. Tell you what you're actually dealing with. Structurally, might be better than you think, might be worse. But you'd know instead of guessing. That's..." Foster started, didn't finish, because he wasn't sure what it was yet. "And if it's fixable," Grady went on, still careful, still watching the rain instead of Foster's face, like he already knew this part needed room to land soft. "I could help you fix it. I've got some money saved. Not enough to erase 40,000 in debt, but enough to matter. And I know contractors, suppliers, people who owe me favors from other jobs. I could get material at cost. I could put in the labor myself, for free, alongside whatever crew we'd need." He finally turned his head, met Foster's eyes. "I'm not saying it to be a hero. I'm saying it because I think your grandfather's farm is worth saving, and I think you're the kind of person who'd fight for something like that with his last dollar, and I think you shouldn't have to do it alone if you don't have to." Foster felt something in his chest go very still and then very loud all at once, a kind of vertigo, like the floor had tilted under him without actually moving. He wanted, for one dizzy second, to say yes. He wanted to fall into it, into the relief of somebody else carrying part of the weight, and that wanting frightened him more than anything the flood had done. "No," he said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, too sharp, too fast. "No, I can't. I'm not doing that." Grady blinked, something careful crossing his face. "Foster, I'm not your charity case." The words came out harder than he meant them, edged with something that felt like panic, wearing the mask of pride. You don't even know me. 5 days ago you didn't know I existed. I'm not going to let you throw your savings and your time into a farm that might not even be salvageable because you feel sorry for me. That's not what this is, isn't it?" Foster stood up, needing suddenly to move, to put distance between himself and the steady, unbearable kindness in Grady's eyes. The drizzle caught him as he stepped out from under the overhang, cool against his face. He welcomed it. Welcomed anything that wasn't the warmth of being looked at like that. You feel bad for the guy who lost everything. I get it. It's a nice instinct. But I'm not going to be somebody's project. I've worked that land my whole life. I'll figure out how to save it or I'll lose it. But either way, it's going to be mine, not something you handed me. Grady stood too slower, and there was something in his face that wasn't hurt exactly, but close to it. A kind of quiet absorbing of the blow, the way a man takes a hit he half expected. "I'm not trying to take it from you," he said low. "I'm trying to help you keep it. By making me owe you, by not letting you drown because you're too stubborn to take a hand when it's offered." The words landed harder than either of them expected, and for a moment neither spoke, the drizzle falling soft and grey around them, the parking lot puddled and shining under the flat afternoon light. Foster's jaw worked, and he looked away, out toward the ditch, toward the water, still standing where the road used to be visible, and, underneath the anger, underneath the pride, flaring hot and defensive in his chest. Something else was surfacing, something he didn't want to look at directly, because looking at it meant admitting it was true. It wasn't just pride making him say no. It was fear. Fear that if he let Grady into the wreckage of his life, into the farm and the debt and the grief of it, he'd be admitting how much he already needed him there. 5 days. 5 days, and he'd already built a life around this man's presence, already oriented, every meal, every quiet hour, every restless night around the fact of him being near. To take his help now would mean admitting that this thing between them, whatever it was, whatever it didn't have a name for yet, had already become load-bearing in a way that terrified him more than any flood. "I can't take your money, Grady." His voice had gone quieter now, less sharp, more honest. "I can't take your time. Not because I don't." He stopped, throat tight, unable to finish the sentence, unsure himself which direction it had been heading. Grady stepped closer, not touching him, just closing some of the distance the rain had opened between them. "Not because you don't—" "What?" Foster shook his head, looking down at the wet concrete instead of at him. "I don't know how to owe somebody like that and not fall apart when they leave." The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before it. Heavier, more exposed, the kind that came from saying something truer than intended. Grady didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was very quiet, almost lost under the drizzle. "Who said anything about leaving?" Foster looked up at him then and found he had no answer for that either, only the rain falling soft around them both, and the terrible, fragile hope cracking open in his chest, like something he'd thought long buried.